Now, what I do from this point on in the book is, again, I go through all of that in 3 chapters because I want the story in your head and I want the context in your head. And now we're going to traipse through the New Testament and see, where does this stuff show up? If we were thinking about all this stuff, what would we see in a given passage that would sort of jump out at us? And again, put us on different lines of thinking. And I would suggest lines of thinking that were in the writer's heads. Now, for the gospel section, I do something with the birth, the genealogy, and the ministry of Jesus. The last one, about 2/3 of that chapter is from Unseen Realm. I throw in the story of Legion, which is new. But the first 2, again, you would have had to have read really the Portent, the second novel, to get any of that, or maybe come across something on YouTube. But as far as the birth of Jesus would have alerted literate first century Jews that the Messiah's arrival would reverse the sin of the watchers. And you say, that's just crazy talk. How in the world would hearing about the birth of the Messiah have made anybody think about Genesis 6, okay, the watchers thing? How does that work? It works because of Romans 10, specifically Romans 10:18 and following, Revelation 12, which is the astral signage of the birth of the Messiah, and again, various Second Temple traditions about the birth of the Messiah. Now, to summarize all that real quickly, again, you may have seen, how many of you have seen the YouTube thing of me going through Revelation 12 about the astral prophecy? Oh, very few of you, wow. Okay, during Q&A, if you want to drill down there, we could, but I'll give it to you in summary form. In Romans 10, it's the famous passage where Paul is talking about, hey, how are people going to hear about the Messiah unless somebody tells them? Duh. Okay, and so we have this problem. How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel, and no one's going to hear without a preacher, and the preacher has to be sent, and that whole famous passage. Then Paul asks a rhetorical question. Have they not heard? And you expect him to say, well, of course they haven't heard, Paul. That's why you're so exercised. That's why you're so bent out of shape here. And you're telling us we need to go and be witnesses. But he doesn't say that. Paul says, indeed they have. And you're like, what? Well, what was the other 17 verses about? How does this fit? And he quotes, as his proof text, that they have all heard. He quotes Psalm 19 in Genesis 10:18. Psalm 19 is the passage. The heavens declare the glory of God. Okay. There are 4 verbs of messaging in the first couple verses. Heavens declare, they pronounce, they utter, they have a voice, okay, all this stuff, and it's just sun, moon, stars, and all this kind of thing. And the line that Paul quotes is, their voice has gone out through all the earth. The voice of what? Well, the voice of the heavens. And that's the Septuagint. The Masoretic text actually reads, their line has gone out through all the heavens. And I actually like the Masoretic text there because it's a reference to the ecliptic, the line in the sky. The ecliptic is where the zodiac constellations follow on an annual basis. So I can't prove it, but what I think Paul was referring to is Revelation 12. When John says, talking about the birth of the Messiah, it's Revelation 12, he says, I looked up at the heavens and saw. I think John actually meant what he said. Okay, we've got the woman with the 12 stars around her head, the sun in her midst, the moon at her feet. You can actually plot this out on an astronomy program. And when you do, there are other things that aren't mentioned in Revelation 12 that are really significant, again, to a literate person in the first century. You've got a conjunction of Regulus and Jupiter, the king's star with the king planet, in the constellation of Leo. Okay, the lion, the tribe of Judah, okay? For a Gentile who doesn't know anything about the Hebrew Bible, that conjunction is important because both of them were signs of a royal divine birth. And here they're conjoined, and for a Jew, it's in the constellation of Leo. You have a 90-minute window when all these things are, it's actually 80 minutes. Somebody corrected me the other day. Got an astronomer geek out there, okay. All right, I'll try to remember that. I'll have to just throw away all my books now. But you have a really small amount of time, okay, where all this can occur. And if you plug it into an astronomy program, you get the birth of the Messiah on September 11th, 3 BC. 3 BC is not a problem. Everybody says, oh, it can't be 3 BC because then Herod would have to die in 1 BC. And we all know Herod died in 4 BC. Yeah, except for studies that have shown that 1 BC works quite well, which I've recently posted on my website. I did a happy birthday to Jesus thing on September 11th. You know, but what makes it important is that date in the Jewish calendar is Tishri 1. Tishri 1 was the date in the Old Testament when you inaugurate the reign of your next king. Tishri 1 was also thought to be the birth date of Noah. So Jesus, the Messiah, is the new Noah. Okay, you're starting to see how Genesis 6 sort of creeps into the picture here. What was significant about Noah? Noah's survival, Noah's presence on the earth post-flood signaled, it was supposed to signal the end of the watchers, the end of all this wickedness, the end of all this garbage, okay? There are passages that refer in, again, Dead Sea Scroll text to the chronology of the flood, okay, to, some of this astronomical stuff going on. Specifically, they link it to the constellation of Orion, which in Aramaic is the constellation of Nephilah. Okay, it's the giant, because Orion was a giant. I mean, you have this concatenation of thoughts that, again, to a literate Jew, if they had read John, or, John, Revelation is the last book of the New Testament, so John got this information from somewhere, maybe Mary, maybe the disciple, who knows, he's one of the 12, but he writes it down, and if you had been exposed to that, you're thinking, wow, look, if this is what was in the sky, it means this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and to a Gentile, all those things are consistent because we've got the conjunction, we've got Jupiter, we've got Regulus, we've got Orion, we've got all this stuff. So when Paul says, yeah, they did know. Okay. I don't believe personally that what Paul is referring to is like, y'all know who D. James Kennedy is? Familiar name? D. James Kennedy believed that you could get the whole plan of salvation out of the constellations of the zodiac. I think that goes too far. I don't believe that. But what I do believe that you could know is that a divine king had been born. I think that is what Paul's tracking on. Again, I can't prove that specifically. There's no verse, there's no footnote in Romans 10:18 that says, go look at Revelation 12. Because Revelation 12 wasn't written yet, so we can't quote it. But I think that's what he's tracking on. But if the point is for the book here, if you had that stuff in your head, somebody born on that day who turns out to be this Jesus of Nazareth, who's walking around doing all sorts of miracles and saying, like, I'm the guy, okay, that would have meant something to you. Okay, that would have meant this is the guy who is going to somehow reverse the effects of the wickedness of the world. Okay? It's not a terribly deep thought, but to sort of track with it the way they would have tracked it, is a different story. The genealogy, in a nutshell. Why are the 4 women in the genealogy there? They may or may not all be Gentiles, probably at least one of them, 1 or 2. Some people argue all 4 of them are. It's really not important if they're Gentiles, but why are they the ones included? Quote here from, her name is Amy Richter. This is from her dissertation. She says, while the inclusion of women in biblical genealogies isn't unusual in itself, there are 14 such women in other genealogies, namely 1 Chronicles 2. The inclusion of these 4 women is all the more odd. Who are they? Rahab. Anybody name them? You got Rahab, Ruth. See the neglected, Bathsheba, and Judah and Tamar. Okay, so the quote here is like, you'd think if you were going to put in 4 important women, you'd pick Sarah, Rebecca, okay, Rachel. I mean, major figures in the Torah, but they're not in. They don't get in. The 4 that do are sort of just kind of a mystery. Again, short version of this is that what Richter does in her dissertation, it's pretty recent. She did it at Marquette, which is a school that's becoming known for Second Temple studies. her argument is that the reason these 4 women are in the genealogy is that there is something in their story, either something they did or something done to them, that has something to do with sexual transgression, and the vocabulary used to describe the person and these events borrows vocabulary from Genesis 6. And so Richter argues that can't be a coincidence. And her argument is these 4 women are in here because they're 4 women who have scandalous histories or had something terrible happen to them in the line of the Messiah. And so the telegraphing, her belief is that, and I think she makes a really good case for it, the important point isn't these women and what happened to them and the vocabulary itself, it's who they produce. Who they help to produce. Well, who's on the final end of the genealogy? It's Jesus of Nazareth. And so the one whose genealogy it is going to reverse the effects, again, of the 4 people in the genealogy that had these transgressive histories that point back in some way to Genesis 6. So she believes that Matthew essentially encrypted. I mean, for people who knew their stories, it wouldn't really be encryption, but for us it sort of is. People would have read the genealogy and asked, well, why are these women and not all the famous ones? And then as they thought about their histories, it's like, oh, okay, well, boy, her story goes back there, her story goes, they all go back there. That must mean something. Matthew's trying to tell us something. And what he's trying to tell us is that these 4 women, who you would associate as Jews with this event, they're going to produce the one who undoes this. They're going to play a role here. So again, the whole chapter on that. The ministry, again, two of the 3 things here are familiar to unseen realm readers. In regard to Legion, if you have your, well, you don't need to look it up. I've given you enough here. The exorcism of Legion is about more than suicidal swine. It's about theological messaging, which practically everything in the Gospels is. Legion recognizes that Jesus is rightful Lord of the country of the Gerasenes, which is part of Old Bashan. But in Jesus' day, it was under Gentile dominion. Now, if you look up Mark 1:24, Jesus is exorcising demons in Jewish territory. And if you compare that with Mark 5, where they're in the land of the Gerasenes, it's Gentile territory, the way that Legion addresses Jesus is significant. Because when he's in Gentile territory exorcising demons, anybody want to guess how Jesus is addressed? He is the Son of the Most High. Most High is the key term. Where do we see Most High language that matters for this whole supernatural theology? It's the Deuteronomy 32 thing. Okay, when the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. Most High is a term you would use if you recognize this is the Most High God. And the territory that we control here, that the people around us think is Gentile turf, really isn't. Okay? It belongs to him. So he can go over to the Jews and exorcise demons there, but to make the point that, oh, I'm not just the Messiah for the Jew. I'm not just here to reclaim this little thing about the size of New Jersey, okay? I'm not just here to take that back. I'm also Lord of all the territory. Okay, I'm the Son of the Most High. I am the rightful heir to your turf too. And so again, it's theological signaling. So again, just hinging on, and again, this isn't new to me. Scholars have noticed this for a long time. Why is Legion, why this verbiage, all this kind of stuff. So I included that in the chapter. When we get to the epistles, how many of you follow the podcast? Don't laugh. You know what's coming. Got a handful of you. The depravity chapter and the head covering chapter are 2 things that I did podcast episodes on. In this chapter, again, I get to actually give you the textual citations in the chapter. And then the baptism one is really a slight rewrite of something in unseen realm. But the depravity, the key verse is Genesis 3:19. When Paul is talking about the law, okay, the law was added. It's the same passage where he talks about the law, essentially, being handed down by angels and whatnot. So I do a little bit of that in unseen realm, but I don't do anything with the important phrase here. It says, the law was added because of transgressions. Okay, because of transgressions. Notice it's plural. Okay, it doesn't say the law was added because of a transgression. Because what scholars typically do is they'll read Galatians 3:19 and they'll think, oh, well, the law was added because of what happened in Eden. Okay, it's a reference to the fall. And this chapter is based, again, he's also from Marquette. In his doctoral work, a guy named, his last name's Stewart. I can't remember his first name now. It'll come to me. But he did a paper at SBL, which is the Society of Biblical Literature, a few years ago. And the paper was entitled something like the Law and Transgressions and the Bastard Spirits and the Birth of the Son of God. And so I looked at that in the program and I thought, oh yeah, I'm going to be at that one. Because I couldn't figure out for the life of me, what is this guy going to do? And it was awesome. Tyler Stewart, it was just awesome. And I afterwards I got his paper, but he argues, and I can give you the paper. I actually posted this on my website. And again, he said I could do that. He argues that when Paul says the law was added because of transgressions, he's not thinking about Eden. Just whose transgressions are we talking about? He's thinking of the Watchers and their corruptive influence on humanity. And so he goes through a whole panoply of Second Temple stuff and some grammatical stuff. And again, he says, if you read it this way, it answers certain questions that come in the chapter later on that scholars have kind of struggled with. What was Paul thinking? Because if you're tracking on Eden, then some of the proposed answers or some of the things Paul says don't seem to quite fit. And Stewart's like, yeah, there's a reason they don't fit, because he's not thinking that. If he's thinking this, then what he says over here and half a dozen other places makes sense. And so since Galatians 4, again, talks about the birth of the Son of God and in its relationship to the law and how we're heirs and sons and all this kind of stuff, he links the two things again. He's saying again, the birth of the Messiah is the real thing that would reverse the transgressions, not the law. The law was powerless to reverse these transgressions. The law was sort of like, to kind of either forestall or put a fence around or hold in the wickedness to a certain extent, but it couldn't really do anything more than that. And in fact, it became a thing that people would resist, again, because they're sinners. So it's a really interesting proposition. But I give you a whole chapter, again, of his argument with the passages and whatnot, and then talk about how it might fit in the bigger picture. I think he presents a really good case. The head covering, just go listen to episode 95. The head covering, the issue there is the phrase, because of the angels. And people have wondered about, well, why is Paul talking about, this head covering thing, and women, first part of the chapter, they should have their head covered. Then he changes and says, well, they do have a head covering. It's their hair, and I'm telling you this because of the angels. It's like, what in the world is this guy on? What is he talking about? This chapter, again, in that episode of the podcast, this is going to sound, I always have to say it this way, this is going to sound like the craziest thing you've ever heard. So I'm just prepping you. I'm just prepping you if you've never heard this. Just go back and listen to episode 95 or get the book when it comes out. There's a guy named Troy Martin. He teaches at Xavier now, or he did when he wrote these articles. But I came across it was a series of 3 articles printed over the course of 11 years. It tells you how fast things get published in journals. But the first one was Martin's article where he argued that the head covering Okay, the woman's hair is her parabolion, the head covering, is actually in Greek medical texts the word for testicle. And you think, what in the world does that have to do with anything? His whole article is going through Greek and Roman, Greco-Roman medical texts and showing, and he quotes Hippocrates a lot, he quotes Aristotle. They believed that a woman's hair assisted in fecundity. That is, when a woman had sex with a man, her hair, they believed, actually helped draw the semen up into her uterus through the course of her body so that she would get pregnant. That's why you don't cut it. Okay, you shouldn't do that. And that's also why it's a shame for a man to have long hair, according to Hippocrates, because the male role is to eject semen, not retain it. It's totally bizarre. It's absolutely bizarre. But when you read what they thought of the function of a woman's hair versus men, everything Paul says in that passage makes sense. Yeah. It just makes sense. But it's so foreign to us that we know where babies come from. And we talk about genetics and do this in a petri dish, and they're not doing that at all. Okay, they're not doing that at all. This is Hippocrates, who at the time was like the leading figure. There's one great thing about the test of infertility. That's just great. How it involves, having a woman smell something and the hair is involved. It's just the craziest stuff you've ever read. But if that's what you're thinking, if that's what's in your head when you read Paul, you're like, oh, well, of course. Of course, when we're in church, we should wear a covering over our hair, because then it's an issue of modesty. Would you go to church and just expose your genitals? Would you do that? Would you do that? I mean, that's essentially what Paul's saying. You people are nuts. Of course, he's writing to the Corinthians, and they probably could, they're doing everything. So, he's like, you people are nuts. Of course, you should have, your head covered when you go to pray and you do these things. And of course, it's a shame for a man to have long hair, again, because he's presupposing this function. A woman's hair is given to her as her covering, as her parabolion. This is her glory, because it helps her to have children. And children are really important, okay? And then Paul throws in this thing about, now I'm also writing this because I'm expressing my concerns because of the angels. There's only one context for that.
Yeah.
Apparently in the back of Paul's mind, he's like, you better get this under control. You better watch what you're doing. You better again, wear the appropriate things. You better behave the appropriate way. You want to show that you belong to a man. You belong to your husband. You're going to be modest. You're going to control your sexuality, your sexual behavior. Because if you don't, we've seen what can result from that. You're being watched, pun intended. Okay, so in Paul's mind, this was a concern for him. To us, it's this most throwaway, bizarre, what in the world does that have to do with anything? But again, if you're reading it through those eyes, everything in the chapter makes sense. In terms of what we do today, I have Mennonites, in my family. I'm not going to go tell them, hey, hey, let me tell you what the head covering is really about. I'm not going to, look. And one of them is a pastor too. It's like, look, if this is what you want to do, and your teaching point is modesty, whatever, go ahead. That's a good idea. You're fine there. But again, it has quite a different context than what you'd think. The baptism thing you've heard about before, reading the book. The fourth part here. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, I'm doing pretty well. In the book of Revelation, I have 2 chapters here that go through Revelation, and again, just pick out maybe 3 or 4 items that specifically link back to the Watcher story. The one chapter is about, again, this transgression of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the Antichrist. Now, what I do in this chapter, just going to give you a sweeping overview here, is I summarize the Second Temple Jewish profile of what they expected as, from a Messiah. And also, in turn, what they expected about the great messianic enemy. Because in their mind, there's Messiah, okay? He's going to come at the end of days and all this stuff. He's going to get rid of the oppression. Well, he has an enemy. So to a Jew, what did that enemy look like? How do they think about it? Again, this great messianic enemy. There are certain things about the enemy's profile that in Jewish texts, again, of this period, were linked to certain figures in Jewish demonology. One of the main ones is Belial. It's also spelled as Beliar in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The belief was that the great enemy of the Messiah, catch the reasoning, since the Messiah was the Son of God, the Son of the Most High, again, this divine Davidic figure, therefore, there were Jews who speculated that his enemy would also either be the incarnation of or under the control of Belial, who was one of the Dead Sea Scroll terms for Satan. There were also, though, other Jews who thought, well, okay, it could be like an incarnation of Satan or something like that. And that's very familiar to us, the way, sort of Antichrist thinking is popularized. That's the normal one, again, for our day and age. But there are other texts that thought, well, no, wait a minute. Maybe it's not the incarnation of Satan himself. Maybe it's the incarnation of one of the fallen watchers. Because there are certain ways that the great enemy is described that link back into the Greek story, classical Greek story of the Titans, which again, if you're familiar with the story of the Titans, and I go through this in the chapter, there are very explicit connections between the Greek Titan story and the Book of Enoch and Genesis 6 language, and just general giant language in the Old Testament transmitted through the Septuagint. One of the ones that I talk about is Belos. This is actually a description from it's either Philo or a text called Eupolemus. He talks about Belos, who was a giant, who was the son of Kronos. Again, if you know anything about the Titans, Kronos is an important Titan, who gets linked, he gets described as the person who built Babylon and the Tower of Babel. And then other Jewish texts link Belos specifically with Nimrod. And so again, here's how I'm asking you to look at this stuff. Again, I'm not presenting this as, oh, this should be our theology of Antichrist now. What I'm saying is that if you were living in the first century and you were having a conversation with a literate Second Temple Jew and you were talking about the Antichrist, this is going to be part of his conversation. This is how he's going to perceive this great enemy. And there are parts of it that you can trace into the church fathers. By the way, in that chapter on depravity, Irenaeus and Tyler Stewart would be buddies, because Irenaeus also traced human depravity back to Genesis 6, not just Genesis 3. And again, he's a famous church father. But Irenaeus also tracked on this. He refers to, when he's discussing 666 in his comments about that passage in Revelation 13, he gives a couple speculations for what the number might mean. One of them is Teitan. Teitan by gematria equates out, spells out in numbers 666. Teitan was one of the words for the Titans. And again, he's getting this from his acquaintance with Second Temple Jewish material. And he goes into the Titan story himself. So Irenaeus is a famous church father that very evidently had taken the time to read lots of this stuff, had probably lots of conversations with Jews or Jewish converts. And again, that helped him look at the Old Testament, look at certain things, even in the New Testament, in a different way. And so Irenaeus is an important figure for this whole discussion, because he's a good indication that Mike isn't just making this stuff up. Okay, he's a good indication that Mike is observing what Irenaeus thought and saying, hey, that's kind of interesting. Where did he get that? Where did he come up with that? And you can, again, trace the series of thoughts back in the primary texts. The second chapter of this section is about different things in the book of Revelation. Revelation 9 I talk about because it has very, very explicit imagery to the release of the Watchers. Again, connecting that this is the release of the guys from the pit, from the abyss. And there are things in the passage that link back into Enochian material. The 144,000 is kind of interesting. I personally would still put this, I'd need to see more on it. I'd still sort of file this as in Mike's head, sort of speculative, but I put it in the book. There's an article by a guy who, it's actually two people, who published in a journal from South Africa. And it's a very long article, it's very detailed, but here's their view. They pick up on, when the 144,000 are described, they are described as being virgins who have not defiled themselves with women. And you think, well, who cares? So what? I mean, it was okay to get married in the Old and New Testament. Big deal. Well, what they try to demonstrate, and I think, again, they present what I'd call a reasonable circumstantial case for it. At least that's my thinking now. There are certain things in the description in Revelation 7 and Revelation 14 about the 144,000 that link back to Levitical language, the way priests were described. And we know priests were allowed to marry. So the question for them then becomes, why this statement? He believes that the 144,000 are people selected by God to, he doesn't believe they're just humans, okay? They sort of waffle there because they differentiate them from the souls that are martyred under the throne and whatnot. But he thinks they are deliberately there to be representatives of God, and they are presented as, pure in terms of these are heavenly ones who have not defiled themselves with women. In other words, they are the counterparts to the Watchers who just got released. And so they are part of this cosmic Armageddon conflict, the war between gods and men. Okay. Again, I think they build a good circumstantial case for it. I'm not completely persuaded of it yet. But I thought it was worth putting in. The Antichrist from Dan tradition. This is also the 144,000. Oh, there's 12,000 from every tribe. What could be simpler? Yeah, until you count the tribes. Until you actually look at the tribes that are missing. Okay, okay. There's Ephraim. There's a deal with Ephraim and Manasseh going on there, but the one that's omitted totally is Dan. And so you have this. You have a pretty long church history tradition that the Antichrist would descend from the tribe of Dan. Okay, I don't believe that the point is the tribe of Dan. I think the point is the region of Dan, which is in Bashan. Same name. Okay, so that, again, in the chapter I talk about, well, if we were thinking region instead of tribe, where would that lead us? Because it's Bashan, it's the place of the serpent, in the Old Testament. Talk a little bit about Gog and Armageddon. Again, Gog is the great enemy from the north. Okay, if you remember Unseen Realm, what is it about the north that's important? Saphon. It's the domain of Baal. Okay, that's not a coincidence. Again, to cast Gog in that language, and I do a little bit about. There's a reason I think why Gog has never been identified successfully with a historical person, either in antiquity or currently, because I think the point is not to direct our attention to a specific person, it's to direct our attention, again, to cosmic evil that will control whoever this Antichrist person is. And so I talk a little bit about that. And if you do that, again, you connect it back to Bashan, and then I go into connections between Gog and the Rephaim. Well, how in Gog are the Rephaim connected? Well, if Gog is coming from the othermost parts of the earth, Saphon. And if the Antichrist guy is coming from the same place, that's also the region of the Rephaim, the giants. Again, you can do the math from the rest of that point. Again, it's not hard to connect the ideas once you get that point of geographical orientation. Cosmic north, region of Bashan geographically. And there are specific, again, links to the Titans and one particular Titan, Typhon. Again, there's a whole article on how Daniel 11 is sort of this chronology of the Antichrist that we get, how Daniel 11 tracks on the story of Typhon in Greek literature, okay, or vice versa, depending on your view of the authorship of Daniel. Okay, there are a number of connections, and why that's important is because the figure of Daniel 11, historically, everybody, whether they think Daniel was written in the 6th century or the 2nd century, everybody agrees that the person who fulfilled all of these things in Daniel 11 already, and that'll echo out into a future prophecy, is who? Everybody remember the name? Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who is the Typhon figure in Greek literature. Again, if you're a literate Second Temple Jew, you're familiar with Hellenistic material, these are not coincidences. They all mean something. They're all part of a matrix of ideas. So it's a way to connect the Antichrist to another one of these Watcher, Titan, giant, supernatural bad guys. And so that's what I do in the chapter. Again, I'm just trying to show you in these 2 chapters how a Second Temple person who had knowledge of this material, how they would read Revelation. Not how Tim LaHaye reads it, okay? Or anybody else, Ritterboss or whoever. How would a Second Temple Jew read it? What thoughts would they think? What would pop out of their mouth in discussion if you had that guy in your small group study on Revelation? What he's going to be talking about is just going to frighten everybody else in the room. Okay? Because he is just on a totally different track. Because he has lots of this stuff floating around his head. And the last thing is the lake of fire, again, which if you follow the podcast, we did an episode on the lake of fire. And that language comes really explicitly out of Enoch. Lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Okay, this is where they're sent. They're sent to the abyss. Who's sent there? Well, the only ones we know that were actually sent there are the Watchers, and who else do we find there in the Old Testament? The Rephaim. Again, these things are not coincidences. They're not just random occurrences in the text. You have people, John writing Revelation, hooking you back into the Old Testament, hooking you back into Second Temple literature that he assumes you know. If you're literate, you know this. I don't have to spell everything out for you. Our problem is we don't know that stuff because we haven't read it. We can have it, we can read it, but the book here, again, we'll just end with that, is kind of an effort to take 10 chapters of that stuff. And it's a little wider net than that. But anything that scholars would think is Enochian, and try to get that in your head, and it's like, okay, now let's go to these New Testament places and just see what pops out to you. Again, how you would parse it if you were thinking this.